Hello, this is Robert Miller, and we're going to continue our discussion about the regression equation. And I say continue the discussion because this is part two of our discussion about the regression equation. All right, so I'd like to begin with is talking about the regression coefficients. So B sub 1, B sub 2, B sub 3 in the regression model. And as we talked about before, you have a regression coefficient for each of the predictor variables in the model. Okay? And what I'd like to address is, first of all, what is the regression coefficient? So the regression coefficient, B sub 1, for our predictor variable x sub 1, for example, describes quantitatively, so in terms of a number, the strength and direction of the relationship between values on the predictor variable measure, here for our first predictor variable, with the outcome variable measure. Okay, so that is what a regression coefficient is. For each of our predictor variables in the model, the regression coefficient for each of these predictor variables is a quantitative description of the strength and direction of the relationship between the predictor variable measure for a particular predictor variable and the outcome variable measure. All right. We'll have more to say about that later, but that's basically what a regression coefficient is. All right, now what I'd like to do is I grab for a marker here. We'll add an additional color here to our regression equation. Is I'd like to start filling in what some of these variables may be. Okay, we'll give them more specific names in terms of constructs. So y hat, and if you remember from our first discussion about the regression equation, that is the predicted value on the outcome variable measure for each of the participants in our sample. And we're predicting that value on the outcome variable measure, again, for each of the participants in our sample from the model. Okay, so from the regression model, which is this portion of the regression equation right here. This is called the regression model. And the prediction for each participant in the sample of their score on the outcome variable measure from the model is based on each participant's scores on the predictor variable measures, each of which has a particular relationship with a particular strength and direction, okay, described by our regression coefficients, with the outcome variable measure. All right, so now let's talk about what some of the constructs might be for this particular regression equation. We'll get specific now as an example. Perhaps we're interested in predicting participant scores on the construct job engagement. Job engagement is a popular construct in industrial organizational psychology. A lot of research has been done on it. It's really, well, what it concerns is how engaged people are with their work. Do they just come in and just put in their hours, but they're just going through the motions and they're really not engaged in their job at all? They're not finding much purpose in it, much reason to do it, except just to go into work, put in their time, get their paycheck, and that's it. Those would be persons who would be seen at a low level of job engagement. And then you have people who are at higher levels of job engagement where they do find some purpose or some fulfillment in their work, and They have some sense of personal connection with their job and engagement with it. And so those would be more moderate scores on a job engagement measure. And then you have people who are very engaged in their jobs, where the job gives them a great sense of purpose and of fulfillment. And it's not just doing a job for them. I mean, they just really like what they do, get into it, feel engaged with it. And that would be high scores on a job engagement measure. Again, as our outcome variable measure. So job engagement as our outcome variable construct for which we have an outcome variable measure. Now what we want to do is we want to understand job engagement better, okay? And that basically, by the way, is the concern, the primary concern of regression. Basically, ultimately, okay, at its base, before we get into any other issues or questions about regression, what regression is an explanatory tool. It's an explanatory tool. It is a tool for explaining a particular phenomenon. And here, the phenomenon that we are seeking to explain in terms of the predictor variables that are in the model, the phenomenon we are seeking to explain is job engagement. And at its most basic level, we seek to do that in terms of the job engagement measure, because we are seeking to explain in terms of a participant's scores on the predictor variable measures why some participants have higher scores on the job engagement measure, other people have more moderate scores, and why other people have low scores on the job engagement measure. So we want to understand job engagement most basically in terms of scores on the outcome variable measure, in terms of person scores on the predictor variable measures. Okay, well, what might some of these predictor variables be, each with their own particular measure? Let's say that we want to understand one's level of job engagement in terms of persons' personalities. Okay, then what we can do is we can go to the 5-factor model of personality, and after doing some looking at the research literature and some theory, we can decide that we're going to include 3 of those factors, personality factors, in our model. And let's say that the ones that we choose are openness to experience, so I'll have that as OTE, openness to experience. That's one of the 5 factors in the 5-factor model of personality. And that will be our first predictor variable. And what you do, by the way, in measuring person's personality according to the 5-factor model is you give them a measure. You actually give them one measure, and it has 5 subscales on it. One is for openness to experience, another is for conscientiousness, another one is for extroversion, another one is for agreeableness, and another subscale is for emotional stability. But we're just going to go ahead and look at 3 of these personality factors, beginning with openness to experience. And we'll have a subscale on that measure where a person will get a score on that subscale indicating their degree of openness to experience. Our second predictor variable, let's say, is from the 5-factor model, conscientiousness. Conscientiousness, get an S in there, there we go. And conscientiousness as one of the factors of the 5-factor model, by the way, is found everywhere in terms of predicting things. So it'd be a good idea to have the conscientiousness factor in our model. And so that's our second predictor variable. And again, that's a subscale on the 5-factor personality measure. And a person gets a particular score on that conscientiousness subscale. And then we'll have a third predictor variable. And let's say that predictor variable is emotional stability. Emotional stability. There we go. And that's an important factor as well in many phenomena, that we have someone who, we need to know their level of emotional stability. So how are they emotionally in terms of conducting themselves? And so that's a pretty basic predictive variable for explaining many phenomena, in this case, doing its part in explaining job engagement. Okay, so what we're seeking to do here for each of the participants in our sample is we want to predict what their job engagement score is going to be on this outcome variable measure for job engagement in terms of the participants' scores on openness to experience, conscientiousness, and emotional stability subscales of this personality measure. All right, so that's what we're basically doing, is seeking to understand job engagement and one's level of job engagement in terms of higher scores and more moderate scores and lower scores on our outcome variable measure of job engagement in terms of person scores, in terms of these different personality factors, or in terms of important factors of one's personality or aspects of one's personality. So that's what we're seeking to do here. Now, I want to point out something, though, that is important for you to notice. That, basically, but only basically, not in the end of what we're looking to do, but basically, we are seeking to understand higher and lower scores on job engagement in terms of persons' personalities, as it concerns these three personality factors. And so there, the emphasis is on the outcome variable measure. But assuming that you have, and you really do need to have, so we're going to strongly assume that, a reliable and valid job engagement measure, then you're doing a lot more, actually, than explaining higher and lower scores on the job engagement measure in terms of these different aspects of a person's personality. What you're actually doing with a reliable and valid measure, outcome variable measure, in this case of job engagement, is that you're actually looking at job engagement as a personal characteristic, as a characteristic of persons. Okay, so it's not about the measure anymore, but it's about the person and their level of engagement with their job, and seeking to explain that in terms of being at higher and lower levels in terms of these particular personality factors. Okay? So ultimately, we move away from the measure and explaining higher and lower scores on the measure to explaining as characteristics of people in terms of how engaged they are with their jobs and higher and lower levels of engagement. That's what we ultimately want to know. It's not about the measure, but about people. In this regard, this example, about their engagement with their jobs. In this example, in terms of these different personality characteristics. All right, so that is it for now. We will have more to say about the regression equation. You have a good day.